All right. For those of you who are not at the first sessions this morning, my name is Chris Woodard. I'm a solutions consultant with Telerik with a focus specifically on Sitefinity. This is the technical session. We'll actually be jumping into code and looking at Visual Studio. So if some of you technical folks want to come sit closer and switch some spots with business folk, feel free. I will try to zoom in, and if you can't see, just raise your hand. Okay. So the first slide we're actually going to be talking about is going to be Sitefinity Integration Points. Specifically, what does Sitefinity provide from an integration perspective, both from a custom route and some of the out-of-the-box connectors that we have. This will be a more slide-heavy section here. We'll actually jump into the code probably after about 20 minutes. And if you have any questions along the way, feel free to just let me know. I do talk really fast. I apologize ahead of time. Just raise your hand if you need me to slow down. Okay. And actually, I want to take a quick poll out of everyone out there. Who has actually worked with Sitefinity from a development perspective before? Okay. And of you, which one are front-end developers? Okay. That's all I needed to know. So we do have a pretty good mix. We'll try to start out. This will be more basic stuff, and then we'll get into some more complex stuff a little bit later. Okay? So I spoke about this earlier, but Sitefinity started as mostly just a content management system. We're moving more to just being a platform. With that, there becomes a need to integrate because you're not just managing content on a website. You're managing content from other systems, and you need those to talk to each other. A little background on Sitefinity. It is an open .NET CMS platform. It's based on Microsoft technologies, so C#, ASP.NET, MVC. For those front-end developers out there, it plays nicely with HTML5, CSS3, JavaScript, and it is based on MVC and web services as well. Okay, some of the integration points that we have, and we'll talk through each one of these individually. The out-of-the-box connectors. We've got some fully exposed APIs, our native API and our Fluent API. These are both at a C# level. They're code APIs that you can use. We've got internal RESTful services, and this is actually really nice. These are web services. The entire Sitefinity backend is wired up to use these, and they are at your disposal to also use. So essentially, anything that the backend is doing and pulling data from the database, you can do that same thing using the web services. The EventHub. We have some external services you'll be able to connect to, and we'll talk about how you can actually consume your own services from your internal applications. And then we'll talk about a provider model. Providers are essentially a way to have a group of data, but source that from a separate database. And you don't necessarily have to use web services for that. Okay, so the SharePoint connector. This is a pretty simple way to actually just connect this up. You plug in your site information. You have to give an administrator account to SharePoint. It'll actually sync back libraries, calendar items, so documents, videos, images from a Sitefinity perspective. The lists in SharePoint can be mapped to any kind of dynamic content type in Sitefinity. So if you have a custom list in SharePoint, you can bring that over to Sitefinity as any kind of data type. This is a two-directional sync, so you can actually have data in Sitefinity synced over to SharePoint and data from SharePoint synced over to Sitefinity and keep those in sync. So if anything gets changed in your environment, it will make sure that that's replicated. And we aren't using any kind of pointer system for this, so we're not just saying, hey, this item's been created, refer to SharePoint for it. It is actually creating the item in the other system. So if it does get modified, it will need to sync over. It's not just automatically pointing to SharePoint. The Marketo connector. Again, this is out of the box. You just have to plug it up with your Marketo account. It does a few things. Obviously, we looked a little earlier about the personalization fields that it adds. It allows you to personalize based on the lead score or the Marketo fields that you may have set up. It does do some website tracking, so to actually track the activities on the site. And then it does some things with forms as well, so you can actually assign somebody to a specific lead score based on how they fill a form out. Salesforce connector. Again, this fits pretty well into the integration scenario, specifically with the DEC. What this allows you to do is if you have a form on your Sitefinity site, you're collecting their name, their company, their address, all this information, you can bring that over into Salesforce as a lead. And you can hook that up to your Sitefinity forms, so that happens dynamically. It also will do, if you have leads within Salesforce, you can bring that over to Sitefinity as a new user. So you can essentially create this as its own membership provider, where anybody in Salesforce can log into your Sitefinity site with their account. And on that note of membership providers, we do have Active Directory and LDAP integration. This is actually going to live in the back end underneath the advanced settings. Again, all you need to do here is plug in your Active Directory settings. And for those Active Directory folks out there, you can do queries and set up your filters so you can pull the right groups and group names. All those fields are available to you. This is actually going to bring those users into Sitefinity. So I was talking a little bit earlier about providers. This will create a new LDAP provider. And with that, when you're looking at users in the back end, you'll have two tabs. You have your default provider, which is just Sitefinity users, and you have your LDAP provider. And if you click that tab, it's actually going to make a request off to Active Directory and show you all those users that you pulled in from your LDAP. From a permissions perspective, the permissions will still live in Sitefinity. You're just going to remap those based on the role that gets brought over from LDAP. So to a certain extent, you can kind of keep your permissions intact when you bring it over from Active Directory, as long as you're bringing your roles in. Okay, some of the Sitefinity APIs, again, these are fully exposed to you. They're built using .NET, C#. We have the RESTful services. They're standard and Fluent. I already talked about all this, but I'm actually going to show you some sample code here. And I hope this is visible. The first block we have is an example of our native API. And you can tell that it's the native API because it has what's called a manager. You see we got newsmanager.getManager. And whenever you're using those managers, you're using the native API. Down below, we have the Fluent, and you can tell that because app.workwith. Whenever you're using app.workwith, you're using the Fluent API. Behind the scenes, they're doing the same exact thing. These are both pulling back a news item from the system. Really, the only difference is the time to develop between the two. Obviously, the one down below is a lot shorter, and the one above is a little longer. From a functionality and usability perspective, if you are a Sitefinity developer and you're going to be doing this a lot, I recommend getting in tune with the native APIs, which is the one on top. I know it's a little bit longer and a little more work, but it actually has a lot more functionality, and you have a lot more control over what's happening. With the one-liners, you kind of just have some very simple queries you can do. But with the managers, you got a lot more control. Okay. So our RESTful services, again, these are our web services that the backend are using. They're all RESTful. So if you just send a request to one of those web services with no queries, it's going to return back a list. If you send a post request, it's going to create an item. If you try to send an update request, it's going to update. Delete request, it's going to delete. That all works out of the box. And this will show you a good way that you can actually figure out how to use those web services. Is everyone familiar with Chrome's network inspector? Okay. You can actually use that or use this, which I think is Postman, to look at one of those web services and essentially see how it works. If you're browsing the back end, what's really nice is you can use the Chrome inspector to watch the services calls that it's actually making. This is an example of the news item service, and it's returning back a list of news items, which is what this section right here is. That's JSON, so then you can use it. You can plug it up with client side and do some nice Kendo stuff with it even if you need to. I do want to point out that any web services that are living underneath this Sitefinity services folder are going to be backend services. You can use them, but you need to authenticate to use them. There's another web service which you'll use to do that. That's the user's web service, which I can show you when we actually open up a Sitefinity project here. There is another folder called public services, which is Sitefinity/services/public, I believe. And those ones you can access and query without needing any authentication. And if you're going to integrate with a separate product or a separate system, these web services are a good route for doing that. Okay. So as far as hooking to your own external services, let's just take a look at this code sample here. This is a little bit small. I apologize. Who out there is using Kendo? Okay. So Kendo is a JavaScript framework. It actually comes built into Sitefinity as part of your license. You are free to use it within your Sitefinity projects. And it makes consuming other web services very easy because essentially all you have to do is pass in, where's my mouse? Pass in the path to that web service to Kendo, give it some parameters as far as like what you're actually doing with that. So in this case, we're creating a grid. This is going to create a table of data pulling back from this web service. So we're specifying things like the columns, whether or not we want this table to be filterable or pageable. And by doing that, it's going to automatically turn this little div container here into a table of data from an external system. Okay, this is an example of that. So this is the finished product of that code I was just showing you. This is essentially hooking to that web service. It's bringing in all that data. Now all I have to do is this is on a Sitefinity widget. I drag that widget on my page or even onto my backend pages because the Sitefinity backend is customizable. And you've essentially just integrated your own internal web service or external web service with Sitefinity. There really isn't any difference from a Sitefinity perspective when you're integrating a separate product into the tool. It's all just using the custom tools that are available to you. Okay, the EventHub. This is essentially it's a messaging system in Sitefinity. And what it does is whenever a specific event gets fired, you can subscribe to that event. And I've got an example of that here. This is the media content downloaded event. And what this does is anytime somebody is downloading a video or a document or an image in Sitefinity, they're hooking onto that event and they're running their own custom code. So in this example, they're doing essentially, hey, somebody has downloaded our document or our video. We're going to do a call off to our own web service and do some tracking on that so we can track how many downloads we've gotten for that document. This bottom example is just for form validation. Whenever you try to submit a Sitefinity form, it'll attempt to validate that against certain fields and regular expressions. You can actually use this event here to hook onto that and add some extra validation steps into Sitefinity forms. And I know we don't support regular expressions out of the box with our form fields. This gives you a good way to do that. And it actually calls it with an AJAX request on the client side. You can actually create your own custom events as well. So if you have your own internal project or module and you need to watch for something that's going to happen, you can use this to actually create an event and subscribe to it elsewhere in your code. So it's a really nice system for post-processing. An example of e-commerce, I typically try to explain that after an order is placed, you have all these products, and maybe you need to send in a request off to your ERP system to change the inventory tracking. That's a really good use case for the EventHub. Okay, the provider model. So providers are essentially a middleman between the user interface, and we can see we've got the manager, and then your data storage. So in the case of the out-of-the-box Sitefinity providers, you have the news manager and the Sitefinity database. And between that is the news data provider. That news data provider has a method called getNewsItems. And what that does is it's actually sending a SQL query off to Sitefinity's database to get those news items. So what I was trying to explain to someone earlier is these providers, you can have custom ones. You could have custom news provider, and then what that's going to do is it's actually going to add a new section on the back end of Sitefinity specific to your provider. You click on that tab, just like with those LDAP users, that was its own provider. You're going to have a list of news pulling from your own data repository. So the way that connects is maybe you have a database of data. Maybe it's news articles, internal. And you need to bring that into Sitefinity and also make it editable. A good scenario for this would be a provider. You can use that provider, point to that data store. It's going to bring it into Sitefinity like it's in the native database. You get permissions on it, you got workflows on it, you can do personalization on it. All the same things that you would have on a standard Sitefinity content type, you can do with your own custom providers. Yep. Yeah, that's fine. Go ahead. That could be a use case for it, yeah. So maybe you have an internal application like your other CMS. It's writing to a specific table. but you also need to give Sitefinity the ability to access that. Now, Sitefinity is not going to replicate that data. It's actually pointing at that database. So in that case, both of those systems would be in sync, and they'd be pulling from one repository. But yeah, that's a use case for that. Okay, and this is actually just a quick example of how you set those up. Creating a custom provider is really just creating your own provider type, which you can plug in here. And aside from that, all you have to do is register it in the list of providers. And it's automatically going to show up in the back end as a new tab with the title that you provide here. Okay, and we don't need to get too much into this right now, but this is an example of another provider that Sitefinity has out there. This is called a storage provider, not necessarily a data provider like news or the membership provider that I was talking about earlier. Storage provider essentially says, whenever you save an image in Sitefinity, I want to send that image instead of into the Sitefinity database to the Amazon cloud. So you can also create storage providers and send those off to different clouds. We have out-of-the-box providers for Amazon and Azure now. Okay. And just to review, multiple integration points. There's a number of different ways with providers, web services, APIs, the EventHub. It's sometimes hard to actually figure out which one you need to use. That's what I'm here for. If you guys do run into questions like that with your implementations, shoot that over to me, and I can help clarify some of that stuff.